The Celestial Academy of Advanced Learning floated in geosynchronous orbit above Proxima Tertius, a planet so peaceful that its most dangerous predator was a herbivore that occasionally sneezed too aggressively. The Academy itself was a monument to galactic cooperation, a gleaming sphere of crystalline architecture and impossible geometries that housed approximately 14,000 students from 673 different species. It was, by all official accounts, the safest educational institution in the known universe. This was primarily because, until recently, they had never admitted anyone from Earth. The admissions committee had debated the human application for approximately 6 standard months, which was 4 months longer than they had spent debating whether to accept the sentient gas cloud from Nebula Sector 7. The gas cloud, at least, could be contained in a standard atmospheric regulation chamber. Humans, according to every database the committee could access, were walking biological disasters wrapped in skin that was somehow both absurdly fragile and frustratingly resilient. Earth, the reports indicated, was classified as a Class 4 Deathworld. Not the worst in the galaxy, but certainly nothing to sneeze at, unless you were that herbivore from Proxima Tertius, in which case sneezing was your primary survival mechanism. Class 4 meant that approximately 60% of Earth's life forms could kill you in novel and interesting ways. The weather regularly attempted genocide, and the dominant species had somehow looked at all of this and decided that the appropriate response was to invent extreme sports. The committee had ultimately approved the application because, as Dean Calrathis had pointed out in his 8-hour presentation, refusing humanity's request would be discriminatory. Also, the humans had hinted that rejection might hurt their feelings, and nobody wanted to discover what a hurt human was capable of. So Tessa Kowalski had arrived at Celestial Academy 3 months ago, and so far, she had not killed anyone. This was considered a rousing success. The Academy had, of course, taken precautions. Tessa's dormitory room was monitored by 6 different security systems, none of which she knew about, and all of which she had accidentally disabled in her first week by trying to improve the environmental controls. The cafeteria had hired a specialized human nutritionist who spent 14 hours per day ensuring that Tessa's meals did not contain anything that might upset her Deathworld digestive system, which was apparently capable of processing ethanol as a recreational activity. Most significantly, every professor whose class Tessa attended received a comprehensive briefing on human psychology, physiology, and the 17 different ways humans had historically responded to academic stress. The list included crying, which seemed normal, and something called pulling an all-nighter fueled by coffee and spite, which seemed horrifying. Professor Vexus Thorian had attended his briefing with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for disarming antimatter bombs. He was a Quilixian, which meant he stood approximately 7 feet tall, possessed 4 arms, and had skin that shifted through various shades of purple depending on his emotional state. Currently, as he prepared for his Advanced Interspecies Conflict Resolution Seminar, he was a pale lavender that indicated moderate anxiety. The course was famous across the Academy for its practical approach to diplomacy. Students did not merely learn theory. They engaged in carefully controlled simulations of diplomatic incidents, learning to navigate the complex web of galactic politics without accidentally starting wars. It was, Professor Vexathorian believed, the finest course in the entire curriculum. It was also about to become significantly more interesting. Tessa arrived at the seminar room exactly 3 minutes early, which was her habit. She had learned in her first week that most species considered punctuality a virtue, though the chronally displaced species from Sector 9 considered it a hate crime against temporal flexibility. She was dressed in what she considered standard student attire: dark pants, a jacket over a shirt with something written in human script, and boots that looked entirely too practical for a space station. The other students were already present, arranged in a careful semicircle, that left a noticeable gap around the seat designated for the human. Tessa noticed this, as she noticed most things, and her expression suggested she found it mildly entertaining rather than offensive. There was Pip Tilak, a Ferothian whose crystalline body structure meant he communicated primarily through light refraction patterns. He had been friendly enough, though Tessa suspected he was primarily interested in her because humans were carbon-based, and he was conducting research on carbon-based musical theory. Next to him sat Yora Mindell, a Cassiopean who looked like someone had taken a dolphin, given it 6 tentacles, and taught it philosophy. She had been the first to actually speak to Tessa, like a person rather than a curiosity. And Tessa appreciated that more than she usually showed. Further along were 3 Vexillian students, whose names Tessa had not quite memorized yet. Primarily because Vexillians communicated their names through scent markers, and Tessa's human nose could not detect approximately 90% of their alphabet. They seemed nice enough, if prone to huddling together and vibrating nervously whenever she walked past. And then there was Zarketh. Zarketh was Kreenathi, which was a species that had mastered faster-than-light travel approximately 3,000 years before humans had figured out agriculture. The Kreenathi were tall, elegant, and possessed a social structure that made feudal aristocracy look egalitarian. They had scales that shimmered like oil on water, eyes that saw into the infrared spectrum, and an attitude problem that transcended cultural boundaries. Zarketh, specifically, was the 3rd son of a Kreenathi counselor, which meant he had been raised with the understanding that he was inherently superior to approximately 98% of galactic civilization. The remaining 2% included his older siblings and possibly the Kreenathi Emperor, though Zarketh had some private doubts about the latter. He watched Tessa enter the room with an expression that translated roughly to contemptuous amusement across most species. Humans, he had decided within 30 seconds of meeting Tessa, were primitives who had stumbled into galactic society through sheer luck and the galaxy's misguided sense of inclusivity. Tessa sat down, pulled out a datapad that was definitely not Academy-issued, and began reviewing her notes with the calm focus of someone who genuinely enjoyed learning. This, somehow, annoyed Zarketh even more than if she had been disruptive. Professor Vexithorian entered with his usual dramatic flourish, all 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of academic enthusiasm. His skin had shifted to a confident violet. "Welcome, students, to what I believe will be our most challenging seminar yet," he announced, his voice resonating through the universal translator nodes embedded in the room's architecture. "Today, we tackle the scenario of the disputed station incident of 2847, where a simple trade disagreement nearly resulted in a system-wide conflict." He manipulated the holographic display with 2 hands, while the other 2 gestured expressively. The display showed a space station, various ships, and an increasingly complicated series of arrows indicating diplomatic relationships. "The key to this scenario," Vexithorian continued, now a pleased purple, "is recognizing that all parties believed they were acting reasonably. The Morthian delegation thought they had secured exclusive trade rights. The Balerian Consortium believed the contract allowed for competitive bidding, and the station administrator was simply trying to maximize revenue while maintaining neutrality." Tessa raised her hand, a gesture she had learned other species found oddly endearing, like a primitive trying to mimic civilized behavior. "Yes, Miss Kowalski?" Vexithorian's skin flickered nervously to lavender for just a moment. Did anyone actually read the contract before signing it? Several students made sounds that the translator rendered as polite laughter. Yora's tentacles curled in amusement. "An astute question," Vexithorian admitted. In fact, all parties had read the contract. The issue was that it had been drafted in Galactic Standard, which contains 17 different contextual markers that can completely alter a sentence's meaning depending on the reader's cultural perspective. So, The problem was not having a better translator or, clearer contracts, Tessa said. It was not quite a question. Zarketh made a dismissive sound. The problem, Primitive, was that the Balerians are notorious for exploiting linguistic ambiguities. Any civilized species knows this. Tessa turned to look at him, her expression perfectly neutral. Right. So the lesson is that some species are just sneaky, and everyone should know that. Very diplomatic. Professor Vexithorian's skin flashed through 3 different shades of purple in rapid succession, which usually indicated internal conflict. On one hand, he appreciated Tessa's directness. On the other hand, preventing interspecies incidents in his classroom was literally part of his job description. The lesson, he said carefully, is that effective diplomacy requires understanding not just the explicit communication, but the cultural context that shapes it. Now, let us move to the practical exercise. The practical exercises were where the seminar truly distinguished itself. Students would be assigned roles in a simulated diplomatic incident and would have to navigate the situation in real time, with the professor adjusting variables to increase complexity. It was stressful, educational, and had once caused a sensitivity major to discover they could photosynthesize stress hormones, which had resulted in an interesting botanical paper. Today's scenario, Vexithorian announced, manipulating the holodisplay to show a new situation, involves a resource dispute on a frontier station. We have 3 factions: the established mining consortium, the newly arrived independent prospectors, and the station authority trying to maintain order. He pointed at various students. Piptilak, you will represent the consortium. Yora, you lead the independents. And Zarketh, you are the station administrator. Zarketh's scales rippled with pleasure. The administrator role was always the most complex, requiring balance and authority. Miss Kowalski, Vexithorian continued, his skin carefully neutral. You will be an observer and consultant. Your role is to analyze the situation and provide recommendations if requested by any party. It was the diplomatic equivalent of being benched, and everyone in the room knew it. Several students' expressions flickered with what might have been sympathy or relief, depending on the species. Tessa simply nodded and leaned back in her chair, looking perfectly comfortable with not being the center of attention. The simulation began. Piptilak's light patterns expressed the consortium's position with admirable clarity. They had been operating in this sector for 15 years, had the proper licenses, and these independents were claim-jumping opportunists. Yora's tentacles waved expressively as she countered that the consortium had abandoned these particular asteroids 2 years ago. The claims had legally lapsed, and the independents had filed all proper documentation. Zarketh, playing the administrator, listened to both sides with the kind of barely concealed boredom that suggested he had already decided who was right and was simply waiting for everyone else to realize it. The solution is obvious, he said, his translator rendering his tone as aristocratic condescension. The consortium has historical precedence and clearly superior operational capacity. The independents should be compensated for their filing fees and relocated to a different sector. Yora's tentacles stiffened. That is not a neutral judgment. The law clearly states that abandoned claims revert to available status after 18 standard months. Law, Zarketh said, should be interpreted in context of practical reality. The consortium is essential to this station's economy. A few independent prospectors are not. Professor Vexithorian, monitoring the exercise, noted that Zarketh was technically demonstrating several realistic administrative biases, though perhaps with more enthusiasm than was pedagogically ideal. He was about to introduce a complication when Tessa spoke up. Can I ask a question? All eyes, visual sensors, and electromagnetic perception fields turned to her. The observer role typically does not speak unless consulted, Zarketh said, his tone making clear what he thought of her interruption. Right. But I am curious, Tessa said, her tone conversational. In this scenario, what happens if the Independents just refuse to leave? Vexithorian's skin brightened with interest. An excellent question. Zarketh, as administrator, how would you handle non-compliance? Zarketh's expression suggested he was dealing with particularly slow children. Station security would remove them, forcibly if necessary. This is standard enforcement procedure. So violence, Tessa said. Enforcement, Zarketh corrected. Civilized enforcement of legitimate authority. Right, but with weapons and stuff. Against people who filed legal paperwork and are just doing their jobs. If they refuse lawful orders, they are no longer just doing their jobs. They are criminals. Zarketh's scales were beginning to shimmer with irritation. Okay. But they would argue your orders are not lawful because you are ignoring the law about abandoned claims. I am interpreting the law appropriately for the situation. Or you are showing favoritism to the bigger operation because they have more money and influence. The room had gone very quiet. Several students were making their species equivalent of nervous gestures. Professor Vexithorian's skin was cycling through shades of purple so quickly it was almost strobing. Zarketh stood up. He was tall, nearly 6.5 feet, and his scales had shifted to a pattern that most species recognized as aggressive display. You're out of line, human. This is an academic exercise, and you are disrupting it with your primitive notions of... Okay, Tessa said, still seated, still calm. But I am just pointing out that your solution is basically might makes right, which is not really diplomacy. It is the application of legitimate authority, which your people barely understand, having only recently climbed down from your trees. Tessa smiled. It was not a large smile. It did not show teeth. It was the kind of smile that suggested someone had just said something either very funny or very stupid, and the person smiling was still deciding which. Trees, she said. Right. Okay. Zarketh took a step toward her, looming in a way that his species had evolved to find intimidating and that had worked on most other species for thousands of years. Perhaps if you had any experience with actual authority structures beyond your little tribal warfare, you would understand how governance functions in civilized society. Zarketh, Professor Vexithorian said, his voice strained and his skin now a pale, alarmed purple. Please return to your seat. This is not appropriate. Zarketh reached into his ceremonial sash and produced a blade. It was approximately 8 inches long, curved and etched with markings that indicated his family lineage. Among the Krinathi, displaying one's ancestral blade was a way of invoking personal honor and demanding respect. It was theatrical, traditional, and generally considered a dramatic but non-violent gesture in their culture. 3 students immediately activated personal shield generators. Pip Tilak's crystalline structure began refracting light in a pattern that translated to alarm. Yora's tentacles all retracted simultaneously, which was the Cassiopean equivalent of diving for cover. Professor Vexithorian's skin went bone white, which for a Quilixian indicated pure terror. Tessa looked at the knife, then at Zarketh, then back at the knife, and her smile widened. Oh, she said, and she started laughing. It was not hysterical laughter. It was not nervous laughter. It was the kind of laughter that suggested genuine delight, the way someone might laugh when a child presents a hand-drawn picture as if it were a masterpiece. Zarketh's scales rippled with confusion, then anger. You dare mock a ceremonial blade of House Zarketh? This weapon has been carried by 17 generations of... That is adorable, Tessa said, still laughing. I am sorry. I am not mocking your family or whatever. But you just... She gestured at the knife, trying to compose herself. You pulled out a knife, in a classroom, as a threat. That is the most precious thing I have seen since I got here. The confusion in the room was palpable. Professor Vexithorian had activated his emergency alert pendant, but seemed frozen, unable to process what was happening. Zarketh's scales had shifted to a pattern that most species associated with dangerous fury. This blade has been blooded in 17 honorable duels. It is 8 inches long, Tessa interrupted, her laughter subsiding into an amused smile. I am sorry. I do not mean to be rude. But do you want to know what we consider a knife on Earth? An actual dangerous knife? Nobody spoke. The translator nodes seemed to be working overtime, trying to render the complex mixture of emotions and tones. Tessa pulled out her datapad and started flicking through files. Okay, so this is a K-bar fighting knife. 7 inches of blade, used by military personnel in actual combat. This is a Bowie knife, about 9 inches, used historically for everything from hunting to, fighting. And this, she turned the datapad around, showing an image, is a machete, 13 to 18 inches, used for clearing vegetation, but also, definitely used in some conflicts. She scrolled through more images. This is a kukri, used by Gurkha soldiers. This is a falcata, which was used by ancient Iberian warriors. And just for fun, this is a Zweihänder, which is a sword that is taller than I am and was used to fight pike formations by literally cutting the pikes in half. Zarketh was staring at the datapad, his scales beginning to shift toward colors that indicated uncertainty. But knives, Tessa continued, putting the datapad down, are honestly pretty low on the list of things that concern us. You want to know what is actually scary on Earth? Miss Kowalski? Professor Vexithorian managed to say, though his voice was faint. Perhaps we should... So we have these things called apex predators, Tessa said, warming to her subject in a way that suggested she had been waiting for this conversation. Polar bears, for example. They can weigh up to 1,500 pounds, run at 25 miles per hour, and have been known to hunt humans for food. Not defense, not territory. Food. They see us as calories. Piptalak's light patterns had shifted to something the translator rendered as horrified fascination. Then, there are saltwater crocodiles. Tessa continued. 20 feet long, bite force of 3,700 pounds per square inch. And they do this thing called a death roll where they grab you and spin until pieces come off. That is not metaphorical. Pieces actually come off. Yora's tentacles were curled so tightly, she looked like a ball. Big cats are fun, Tessa said, her tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. Lions hunt in coordinated packs. Tigers are ambush predators that can take down prey twice their size. And jaguars have the strongest bite force relative to size of any big cat, which they use to crush skulls. They specifically bite through the skull, between the ears, into the brain. That is their whole strategy. Zarketh had lowered his ceremonial blade, though he still held it. His scales were now a color that most translator databases did not have a specific entry for, because Krenathi rarely experienced this particular combination of confusion and existential concern. But animals are not even the scary part, Tessa said. The planet itself tries to kill us pretty regularly. We have storms that level entire cities, earthquakes that drop buildings like they are made of cards, volcanoes that bury civilizations, floods, droughts, wildfires. Our planet has a whole menu of geological violence. Professor Vexithorian had sat down, which he rarely did during seminars. His skin was cycling through colors that suggested his physiological systems were struggling to keep up with his psychological state. And then, Tessa said, leaning forward slightly, there are other humans. The room somehow got quieter. We have had wars that killed tens of millions of people. We invented weapons that can obliterate entire cities in seconds. We created chemical weapons that dissolve your lungs. Biological weapons that turn your own immune system against you. We looked at the atom, the fundamental building block of matter, and figured out how to make it explode. She picked up a stylus from the desk, held it up. On Earth, anything can be a weapon. This stylus, eye, throat, or kidney, if you know what you're doing. That chair? Blunt force trauma? The edge of that desk? Fracture someone's skull if you hit hard enough. We have entire martial arts dedicated to fighting without weapons because we learned that we do not need them. Tessa stood up slowly, and several students flinched. So, when you pull out an 8-inch ceremonial knife that has probably never been used for anything more violent than cutting fancy food at family dinners, and you wave it around like it is supposed to scare me? She shook her head, still smiling that small, amused smile. That is not a threat. That is adorable. That is like showing me a picture of your family's pet and expecting me to be terrified. She walked over to Zarketh, who had not moved. His scales were now a color that the translator finally managed to render as mortified realization. Tessa gently took the blade from his unresisting hand, examined it with the kind of professional interest someone might give an antique, and then handed it back to him, handle first. It is a beautiful piece, she said genuinely. The craftsmanship is amazing, and the family history is important. But it is not a weapon. Not really. Not compared to what weapons actually mean on a death world. She turned to face the rest of the class. You all live in a galaxy that is basically safe, she said. Your planets do not try to kill you. Your animals evolved alongside civilizations that developed ethics and technology in parallel. You have conflicts, sure, but they are about trade agreements and territorial disputes and political philosophy. You do not have wars where the goal is extermination. You do not have predators that see you as food. You do not have weather that can wipe out your entire genetic line in an afternoon. Tessa walked back to her seat. So, when you try to threaten a human with a knife, you are not understanding the context. Humans live in context, where everything is a potential threat, all the time. We evolved to be paranoid, aggressive, and innovative, because anything less and we died. We are not better than you. We are just traumatized by our planet, and we learn to cope through violence and tool use. She sat down, picked up her datapad. Anyway, she said, her tone shifting back to casual. I think the lesson here is that what counts as a threat or as appropriate force is really contextual to your environment and culture. The administrator in this scenario probably should not jump to security enforcement, because that assumes everyone shares the same understanding of authority and appropriate force. Maybe the solution is better mediation, or bringing in an external arbitrator, or actually following the law as written instead of as interpreted for convenience. The room was silent for approximately 20 seconds. Professor Vexus Thorian slowly stood up, his skin now a deep purple that indicated something between awe and academic excitement that was overriding his fear response. That, he said slowly, was the most effective demonstration of cultural relativism in conflict resolution that I have ever witnessed. Tessa looked up, surprised. Oh, I was just explaining why the knife thing was not really. You illustrated perfectly how threat assessment is culturally determined. Vexus Thorian interrupted, his enthusiasm building. How power dynamics shift based on contextual understanding. How assuming universal standards of intimidation or force can lead to catastrophic miscommunication. This is... He manipulated the holo display frantically with all 4 arms. This is pedagogically invaluable. Zarketh had sat down, still holding his ancestral blade, looking like someone had just explained to him that his entire understanding of the universe was fundamentally wrong, but in a way he could not quite argue with. Yora's tentacles cautiously uncurled. So, on Earth, that knife would not be frightening. Depends on context, Tessa said. In a dark alley, any knife is concerning because it means someone intends harm. In a classroom, in good lighting, held by someone in school clothes? She shrugged. I would probably assume it was for show or that they did not really understand what they were doing. And if someone did understand what they were doing? Pip Delac's light patterns formed what might have been a question mark. Tessa's expression went carefully neutral. Then they would not show you the knife first. The room got quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Thoughtful rather than terrified. Professor Vex's Thorian skin had shifted to an excited magenta. Miss Kowalski, would you be willing to provide additional context for future scenarios? Your perspective on threat assessment and conflict escalation could be invaluable for helping students understand species from higher-class Deathworlds. Sure, Tessa said. But maybe warn me first so I do not laugh at anyone else's ceremonial weaponry. That was probably rude. It was extremely rude, Zarketh said quietly, his scales now a subdued gray. But also accurate. I did not understand how it would be perceived. To be fair, Tessa said, I do not think you meant it as a real threat. It was more like a dominance display thing, right? Zarketh's scales rippled in what the translator interpreted as embarrassed acknowledgement. Among my people, displaying one's ancestral blade is a way of demanding respect through lineage and honor. Right. And that makes sense in your culture. But humans do not have ancestral blades. We have ancestral trauma, so we respond differently. Yora made a sound that the translator rendered as nervous laughter. Humans are terrifying. Humans are traumatized, Tessa corrected. There is a difference. We are not trying to be scary. We are just trying to not die. And our planet made that really difficult for a really long time. Professor Vex's Thorian was frantically taking notes on his data pad. This is fascinating. The psychological adaptation to persistent environmental threat creates a fundamentally different baseline for threat assessment. Students, this is why direct translation of diplomatic gestures across cultures can fail catastrophically. The rest of the seminar continued, but the dynamic had shifted entirely. Tessa was no longer the observer kept safely on the sidelines. Instead, she became an active participant, explaining how different scenarios would play out on Earth. What would be considered threatening versus posturing versus actual danger. Zarketh, to his credit, engaged with the discussion genuinely. At one point he asked, "If the knife was not threatening, what would you have done if I had actually attacked you?" Tessa considered this. Probably tried to de-escalate first. Move out of range, keep talking, look for exits. If that did not work and you actually committed to violence? She shrugged. Humans are decent at unarmed combat against armed opponents if we have to be. It is not ideal, but it is doable. Could you demonstrate? Professor Vex's Thorian asked, his academic enthusiasm completely overriding any sense of self-preservation. Not without potentially hurting someone? Tessa said. Human combat techniques are designed to exploit structural weaknesses in anatomy, and I do not know enough about everyone's anatomy here to do it safely. This statement somehow made everyone more nervous and more fascinated simultaneously. The seminar ended with Professor Vex's Thorian assigning a paper on cultural contexts of conflict escalation, with specific emphasis on how environmental factors shape species psychology. Several students approached Tessa afterward with questions that ranged from genuine academic interest to morbid curiosity. Zarketh approached last, his scales a neutral gray that suggested he was trying very hard to manage his emotions. I owe you an apology, he said formally. My behavior was inappropriate and based on incorrect assumptions about your capabilities and temperament. Tessa waved this off. You did not actually hurt anyone or intend to. You were just operating on your culture's playbook. Now you know that playbook does not work the same way with humans. Your planet sounds horrifying, Zarketh said. It really is, Tessa agreed cheerfully. But it is home. You adapt. As news of the incident spread through the academy, the story naturally became embellished. By dinner, rumors suggested that Tessa had disarmed Zarketh in single combat. By the next day, some versions claimed she had demonstrated 17 different killing techniques using only classroom furniture. The administration held an emergency meeting to discuss whether the incident required disciplinary action. After reviewing the security footage, they concluded that technically, no rules had been broken. Zarketh had displayed a ceremonial object, not used it as a weapon. Tessa had provided educational context, not made threats. Professor Vex's Thorian had maintained control of his classroom, albeit in an unconventional manner. What they did do was update the protocol for human students. The section titled Management of Potentially Volatile Behavior was replaced with a new section titled Understanding Deathworld Threat Assessment, which essentially summarized Tessa's impromptu lecture. Professor Vex's Thorian submitted a formal request to restructure his entire curriculum to include modules on Deathworld perspectives. His proposal included bringing in Tessa as a guest lecturer for several sessions, properly compensated and with full academic recognition. The request was approved within 48 hours, primarily because Dean Kalrathis read the incident report, watched the security footage, and concluded that this was exactly the kind of cross-cultural learning experience the Academy was supposed to foster, just with more discussion of apex predators than anyone had anticipated. Tessa's next appearance in the Advanced Interspecies Conflict Resolution Seminar was considerably less dramatic. She showed up with a presentation titled De-Escalation Strategies from a Species with No Natural Weapons, which covered everything from body language to verbal techniques to knowing when to just run away, because sometimes that is the smart option. The students listened with rapt attention. Several took extensive notes. Zarketh asked thoughtful questions about how honor-based conflict resolution could be adapted for species that did not share the same honor framework. At one point, a Vexillian student asked, through scent markers that the translator worked hard to interpret, whether humans were ever afraid of anything. Tessa considered this. Of course, we are afraid of lots of things. Heights, deep water, the dark, social rejection, failure, disappointing people we care about. Being human does not mean we do not feel fear. It just means we learn to function while afraid, because on Earth, you do not get the option to wait until you feel brave. Professor Vex's Thorian skin glowed with satisfaction. This was education. This was what the Celestial Academy was meant to achieve. Not just the transfer of information, but the genuine understanding between species that had evolved under radically different circumstances. After class, as students filtered out, Yora approached Tessa with several of her tentacles extended in what her species used as a friendly gesture. "Thank you," she said. "I think I understand diplomacy better now. It is not about everyone following the same rules. It is about understanding that everyone has different rules and finding the overlap." "That is much more eloquent than how I would have put it," Tessa said. "But yeah, basically." "Also," Yora added, her tentacles curling with what the translator interpreted as amused concern, "please never tell us any more details about Earth's oceans. The brief mention of saltwater crocodiles was enough to give me nightmares." "We also have box jellyfish," Tessa offered helpfully. "Transparent, almost invisible in water, and their venom can kill you in minutes." Yora's tentacles all retracted simultaneously again. "I regret asking." 3 months later, Professor Vexisthorian published a paper titled Threat Assessment Frameworks Across Deathworld and Non-Deathworld Species, a case study in educational intervention. It became required reading for the xenopsychology department and was cited in 6 different diplomatic training programs across 4 sectors. Zarketh went home for a semester break and had a long conversation with his family about perspective, privilege, and the importance of understanding that dominance displays that work in low-threat environments might not translate to species from high-threat environments. His family listened politely, though his eldest sister did point out that she had been saying similar things for years and nobody had listened to her. Tessa continued attending classes, completing assignments, and occasionally providing context that made her professors reconsider their entire understanding of conflict, cooperation, and survival. She joined 3 study groups, a club dedicated to xenobotany, and once accidentally started a campus-wide panic by mentioning that humans could survive in vacuum for approximately 90 seconds if they prepared properly. The resulting emergency safety briefing took 4 hours and included a demonstration of just how many redundant life support systems the Academy actually had. The Celestial Academy updated its promotional materials to emphasize its commitment to true interspecies understanding and education. They carefully did not mention that this commitment occasionally involved human students explaining why ceremonial knives were adorable and apex predators were terrifying. And on Earth, when the story eventually filtered back through diplomatic channels, humanity's response was generally positive. One official noted that it was nice to be feared for their competence at surviving rather than their capacity for causing problems. Though he acknowledged these might be the same thing depending on your perspective. The Academy's admissions committee, reviewing the success of their first human student, approved 4 more applications from Earth for the following academic year. They did update the application process to include a questionnaire about the applicant's homeworld's classification and their personal experience with predation, natural disasters, and what they considered normal levels of danger. One of the new human students answered the question, "What do you consider a dangerous situation?" with, "When the weather forecast says to take shelter immediately, when apex predators change their behavior patterns, or when other humans get really quiet." The admissions committee discussed this answer for 2 hours before concluding that this was probably fine and definitely educational. After all, the entire point of the Celestial Academy was to prepare students for a complex, diverse galaxy. And nothing prepared you for that complexity quite like understanding that somewhere out there, an entire species had evolved on a planet so aggressively hostile that they considered 8-inch ceremonial knives adorable, and found the notion of threatening someone with a blade in good lighting to be more amusing than alarming. The galaxy, it turned out, was full of perspectives that challenged your assumptions. The trick was being open to learning from them, even if the lesson came with a side of existential horror about Deathworld ecology. Professor Vexisthorian, reflecting on the semester while reviewing his notes for the next academic year, concluded that this had been his most successful teaching experience in 20 years, not because everything had gone according to plan, but because one unexpected moment had taught his students more about cultural relativism, threat assessment, and genuine diplomacy than a dozen perfectly executed simulations. He marked Tessa's participation grade as exemplary and added a note. Student demonstrated exceptional ability to provide cross-cultural context and transform potential conflict into educational opportunity. Recommend for advanced diplomatic studies. Tessa, upon learning of this assessment, shrugged and said it was nice. But she was really more interested in the xenobotany track, because Earth's plants were apparently considered terrifyingly aggressive by galactic standards, and she wanted to understand what normal plants were like. This statement prompted 3 professors to preemptively request her presence as a guest lecturer in their respective courses. The galaxy, it seemed, had a lot to learn from humanity. And humanity, through students like Tessa, was perfectly willing to teach those lessons. one casual revelation about Deathworld survival at a time. Though they did try to be more tactful about laughing at other species' ceremonial weaponry. Usually,